But let me move on to things that I know less of, and you know more of. The TRIPS agreement that Professor Solson mentioned yesterday, which was struck in the mid-1990s, the so-called trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, bundles together disparate products: films, music, software, solar technology, pharmaceuticals, genetically modified organisms, seeds. Thus, it grants the multinationals the right to charge high markups to make profit, regardless of whether what they are peddling to the public is a CD, a DVD, the formula for a life-saving drug, or a seed that was previously bred by generations of Polynesian or African farmers before it was slightly modified by Monsanto in the lab. Look at the incentives, that word that economists love, which our world is laboring under. Our institutional setting is telling multinationals, as we speak, to ignore malaria and to invest in tooth whitening, since markups are more likely to come from the latter. It is motivating pharmaceutical manufacturers to indulge in disease mongering in the West, while ignoring diseases that kill millions of people in the poor South. It is rewarding life-saving innovations by egging monopolies on to restrict their dissemination. This is how monopolies make money, by restricting the supply of what they are producing. It is ensuring that solar technology, for instance, the inventors of solar technology maximize their rewards by restricting the utilization of their new solar technologies. As Dr. Spock would have said in Star Trek, it does not compute, Captain. Medical research. Until the 1990s, this is something I've been reading recently, most medical research was carried out in our great and good universities, some in not so good universities. Today, 70% has been privatized. The new commodity is, and this is not my jargon, it's the industry's jargon, the ready-to-recruit patient, an Eastern European or a jobless American, who becomes a guinea pig in exchange for either money or treatment. A process of commodification which created a system where a private doctor makes more money recruiting a patient than by treating her. To me, this is a business model from hell. Now, if I had more time, or perhaps an opportunity to give a second talk, I would have articulated similar arguments about the inanity, the sheer idiocy of the current crop of market-based remedies for the debt crisis that 2008 bequeathed humanity. On both sides of the Atlantic, mechanisms utilizing newfangled forms of derivatives to sort out the mess left by the older sorts of derivatives. But time is a relentless driver, and I must press on. Because the big question is, what now? Do you know the one about the bus that has fallen off a cliff? Of all the passengers, apparently one is calm and confident. Guess who it is? The faithful economist, touchingly convinced that by the time the bus hits the ground, the laws of demand and supply will have equipped all passengers with a parachute. Question. If we discovered, this was inspired by the astonishing projection next door earlier, for those of you who were lucky enough to see it. If we discover that a comet is heading towards Earth, what would we do? If we knew that in 20 years' time, let's say, it can be measured accurately, our planet would be devastated by it, or by some asteroid. Would we leave it to the market to provide a solution? Would we utilize mechanism design and game theory to engineer a new market that would incentivize entrepreneurs and distribute and allocate and price risks in order to do something about it? Hell no. We would scramble NASA, the military, the world's nuclear arsenals, Chinese, Russian, American, European scientists to do something about it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a comet of sorts is heading our way. We need a proportionate response. One that does utilize the markets where possible, but one that crucially transcends them. Humanity, to put it frankly, needs a new human genome come Apollo, come Manhattan Project, the purpose of which should be to produce technological solutions that are absent today, solutions that we haven't had yet. All sorts of gizmos will result from such a large-scale scientific, political, economic research project. But the basic business of saving humanity cannot be left to the markets. It is not a matter of regulating the markets. It is a matter of bypassing them and creating alternatives to them where needed. Some may be wondering, is this guy an economist? Bypass markets? Indeed, most of my colleagues claim that the solution to global warming, for instance, ought to be market-based. Most of my colleagues argue in favor of an emissions trading scheme, an ETS. That is, for the creation of a market for bads, as Herakles was saying, rather as opposed to a market for goods, a market for bads. Pollution is a bad, it's not a good, it's not like apples and oranges. The idea is also called cap and trade. The number of permits to produce carbon dioxide or methane is restricted and goes down year by year. That's the cap. The permits can be sold, hoarded, or used by those who buy them, the industries that buy them. That's the trade. The permits can, for instance, be auctioned off by means of fancy auctions that game theorists will design. For instance, you can have an ascending clock auction where the price is increasing by $1 an hour until enough bidders withdraw from the market and supply and demand for these permits is equilibrated. And that's just one example. This whole talk I submit to you is a recipe for disaster. We will be creating a new derivatives market. Bankers like Goldman Sachs will be feasting in the creation of a new private form of money backed by the taxpayer. A very haphazard form of money, just like the one that burned out in 2008. Meanwhile, no one will be able to predict the prices of these new bads and the derivatives founded upon them. Bubbles will inflate. They will burst. They will reinflate. Every time there is an auction, headlines will appear in the media, like state to run out of electricity because supplier has run out of permits. Or carbon permits force power plant to move offshore. With every such crisis, the public will turn hostile. A mighty new alliance will appear against such controls over pollution. An alliance between, on the one hand, the villains of the piece, the oil, coal, and car giants, and on the other part of that mighty alliance, broad swathes of disaffected people who hate government and hate banks. This is not something that I just conjured up. It's what happened a few months ago in Australia. Mining companies stoked public anger against banks to form an alliance with working class people to overthrow Kevin Rudd, the Australian Prime Minister, who dared back an ETS, an emissions trading scheme, a market solution to climate change. Market-based solutions to climate change will create a tea party in every country. They will forge a new, regressive, impossible to defeat alliance of climate skeptics on every continent. The only way of greening humanity is by means, as I said, of a human genome, Apollo, Manhattan type of project. One that will produce the technology necessary to tackle climate change, the ocean's acidity, malaria, HIV, all the scourges that must be made history. A multinational scientific project in the context of which each country, but not only each country, each company that cares to, each NGO that wants to, can participate according to its capacities and in relation to the sensitivities of its electorate. This is exactly what we would have done if we spotted a menacing comet on a collision course with our planet. We must do likewise now. Such a large-scale project will have amazing spin-offs that markets can then develop into profitable lines of useful products and fancy gizmos. But its running and the knowledge that it produces must and can only be a public good whose value is not approximated by the market, but escapes the market, whose value is incalculable and whose value we do not try to measure. Taxation will have to be part of the project, both funding it and also helping reduce in the meantime our wasteful activities. For instance, instead of the catastrophic ETS, we should implement immediately carbon taxes, beginning, let's say, at $10 per ton today, rising by $5 per ton every year, so that by 2016 it costs $40 per ton to produce carbon dioxide. This would be a clear signal. It would create certainty. It would kill uncertainty. It would prevent more bubbles. I sense some people, perhaps not here, but perhaps here too, asking, is this narrative not a direct threat to the idea of private property, to the idea of free markets? Is this not a return to collectivism? As I said before, 1991 proved that free trade in things is indispensable. However, the private property analogy breaks down when we go from things to ill-defined assets, especially to those from which human life depends. It is not just markets that markets of ill-defined goods are inefficient, it is also, as I said before, that they are illiberal. Take a patent on seeds, or the genome, or medicine, TRIPS. And the current regime of property rights treats as equally inalienable your property rights over your mobile phone as it does a multinational's property rights over a recipe that has the power to save millions. What I'm saying is that this status quo is not merely allowing one to enjoy the fruits of one's labor and innovation, to allow one to enjoy a recipe that one has concocted, but it's a positional good that it is granting. It is granting one the right to stop others from using it. And I don't believe that liberal or even libertarian values or principles can support that. What about the accusation that I'm proposing central planning here, a return of the hated Gosplan? Well, let me give you an example why I don't think I'm doing this. Here's an idea I poached from Thomas Pogge, professor of philosophy and international affairs at Yale University. One that proves that collective agency is not the same thing as state control. Pogge suggested, and is experimenting as we speak, with the so-called health impact fund. The idea is very simple. Create a fund toward which concerned governments, not just one, charities, NGOs, may contribute a sum of money each, with a view of attacking some specific problem, like malaria. Pharmaceutical companies then sign up, give up on the right to charge markups, and instead extract from that fund a sum which is proportional to the net positive impact of their medicines on the ground. And who is going to measure that? But of course, the medical community on the ground. Notice how the companies under that scheme, firstly, they act on the basis of individual private criteria. Nobody tells them what kind of research to do. They do it for profit, by themselves. But at the same time, now they have an incentive to minimize malaria-induced suffering, rather than to secure a monopoly power over something that has no value. What? Over medicines that they would have to pay to sell at a markup that the sufferers of malaria cannot afford.